NATO, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank are all touted as global organizations in which every member is deserving of dignity, progress, and support. Yet these very organizations and others like them are dominated by economic and political heavyweights in Washington, Wall Street, London, and in Brussels, who are working to preserve the ideals of empire that exploit, dominate, or wholly ignore the global south. Now, despite efforts to promote only the interests of the Western elite, emerging economies are growing strong enough to fight modern-day economic imperialism and shrug off the chains of Western hegemony. Take the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and China's One Belt, One Road strategy to link much of the Eurasian landmass via trade and investment. But nowhere is the focus on decentralizing power away from the West more apparent than in the bloc of emerging economic powers known as BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have formed a multilateral political and economic bloc that champions efforts to wrestle power away from Western-dominated organs. As investigative journalist Eric Draitser noted in the first of his exclusive series for MintPress News, Empire Strikes Back, the BRICS countries are home to over 3 billion people. It's the single largest bloc in terms of human capacity among global alliances. Now, the growing muscle exerted by BRICS, he writes, has undoubtedly ruffled a few feathers in Washington and elsewhere in the West. And thus, with feathers sufficiently ruffled by the threat of a potent rival to their economic power, various actors have stepped in over the past 2 years to destabilize and undermine BRICS nations through both political and economic means. And in each case, there's a clear beneficiary, U.S. financial elites and their allies. Now, here to talk more about this is geopolitical analyst Eric Draitser himself. And Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to begin the conversation by asking you, who exactly are the forces conspiring against the growing influence and power of BRICS? And what is it about the blocs that have prompted such attacks against them?
Well, I think first and foremost we should make sure that we understand what we're talking about. It's not some sort of grand conspiracy necessarily. It's not, a few white men in a room plotting to control the world. What we actually see is a pushback by the Western financier, finance capital ruling establishment against what they perceive to be a growing encroachment upon their own hegemony, namely by the rise of the BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the grouping of non-Western countries which had, over the course of the last decade or so, really emerged as growing economies, as developing economies, and as ones that were increasingly becoming interconnected while simultaneously in various ways trying to essentially create a more independent economic global architecture. And that's really, I think, the crux of this issue. It's not simply that the United States and its NATO allies, London and Brussels and all of the rest of them, it's not that they want to crush and destroy all of these countries. Far from it, in fact. They see them each as integral to the Western-centric worldview, to a Western system that has predominated around the globe, at least for the last 100 years, though of course we could probably take it back much further than that. And they don't want to allow any competition to emerge. And essentially that's what they see in BRICS, competition.
Okay, and then in your series, Empire Strikes Back, you were among the first political analysts or journalists to expose Western forces conspiring to inspire public protest against Brazil's government. I mean, can you describe very briefly to our viewers why the massive protests in Brazil aren't necessarily just the result of public frustration with their government?
Well, certainly they come out of a public frustration, but that's not what's really driving the protest. What's driving the protest is the same old script that we've seen trotted out over and over again, where the United States and its various allies foment civil unrest using political proxies in order to effect some kind of a regime change agenda. Whether that regime change comes in the form of bombs, as we saw in Libya, as we've seen an attempt in Syria over the last 4.5 years, or in countless other places, you have that kind of regime change. But you have other forms of regime change, including a manufactured protest movement designed to destabilize and ultimately to overthrow the government in Brazil. That's really what we're seeing here. We've seen this play out according to the color revolution world, and right now we're seeing it in Brazil. And of course, we have to point the finger at those that are directly culpable, for which we have direct evidence. For instance, the Koch brothers, the infamous right-wing financiers in the United States, are directly implicated by various forces inside of Brazil, having funded the organizations that spawned a lot of these protest leaders, that spawned, in many ways, the movement itself, in coordination with a right-wing controlled media in Brazil that is in the hands of the wealthy elite. And these are the elites whose fortunes and whose power is vested not in the working people of Brazil, not even necessarily in the citizens of Brazil, but rather in financial forces centered in Washington, on Wall Street, in London, and throughout Europe. In other words, it's the same story as you see all throughout Latin America. A former ruling establishment on the right with old money and old power seeking to push back against the progressive gains of the last 15 or so years. We see that in Venezuela, we've seen that even in Ecuador and in Bolivia, and we see it right now happening in Brazil, just as we recently saw in Argentina with the resurgence of the right wing under the new president, Mauricio Macri, who, by the way, just like the opposition in Brazil, are all connected to Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and the other giants on Wall Street. It's not a coincidence.
And what do these countries have to offer that present such a threat to these, Western interests? I mean, I know you mentioned economic interests, but immediately what comes to my mind is, of course, Russia, in terms of being a major player in the oil and gas industry. What do you make of this?
Well, certainly commodities and raw materials are on the, in the cards, particularly when it comes to countries like Brazil or even, as I just mentioned, Argentina. Similarly, in South Africa, the mining industry is incredibly lucrative. We've seen increasing moves towards what might be called, if not nationalization, which is really where South Africa was supposed to go under Nelson Mandela and the Freedom Charter, then certainly increased state authority over the mining sector, much more than the mining corporations from the Western countries would like to see, increasingly turning to China for financing of its large-scale projects. And so there is this sort of raw materials, commodities aspect, but raw materials and commodities in particular have fallen quite drastically over the last 18 months to 2 years. And it is the collapse of commodities that leads us then to this second question: what else are they really trying to target with these countries? And I would argue that one of the most important aspects of the assault on the BRICS is to prevent a cohesive, multilateral institution from emerging on the political, economic, and military levels. In other words, the number one threat to U.S. hegemony, as Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in his famous book, The Grand Chessboard, in 1997, the number one threat would be driving Russia and China and Iran into a direct military as well as political and economic alliance. That is de facto what has happened because of the blundering U.S. policy over the last few years, because of particular issues such as Ukraine, such as the expansion of NATO, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the conflicts now emerging in the South China Sea. All of these are driving Russia and China closer together. So there's a lot of forces here, and what the West is really trying to do is to divide them as much as possible, to drive wedges not only between the countries themselves, but into the very domestic fabric of those countries. That's what we see in Brazil. That's what we see with a capitalization on a protest movement in South Africa. And that's what you see increasingly so with Russia and what I would consider to be a global economic war against Russia.
And can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, can you compare how these Western elitists are targeting Russia in comparison to, let's say, India or South Africa? Yeah.
Well, yeah, in Brazil and South Africa, as I mentioned, you have these protest movements, and they are really the main lever for the institutions in the West. Those are the political institutions and those financial elites that back them and that really are their patrons. They are using these protests, these popular mobilizations, in order to destabilize these governments and potentially to overthrow them and replace them with even more neoliberal, more right-wing, more compliant governments. However, in Russia, of course, the situation is vastly different. There you have a very strong government led by President Putin with very very, very high approval ratings, major support, popular support from most sectors of the country. Obviously, there's an opposition, various kinds of opposition, but they're relatively small and aren't really vying for power. And so rather than that kind of political destabilization, we're seeing a more economically focused destabilization against Russia. One of the things is, of course, the collapse of global oil prices. Now, obviously, there are certain market forces that come into play, supply, demand, all of the rest of that. But actually, there's ample evidence to demonstrate that the oil price collapse is directly been manipulated, and it's been manipulated presumably by the United States and the big banks on Wall Street, and of course their proxy in Saudi Arabia and perhaps other forces internationally. And one of the ways that they do this is through market manipulation. The kind of market manipulation that only big banks like Morgan Stanley and Bank of America and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and HSBC and Barclays and all of these huge financial institutions, they engage in precisely this sort of manipulation. And don't take my word for it. There have been hearings on Capitol Hill in the United States looking into precisely this, including government watchdogs from government agencies who have put on record that this is exactly the kind of market manipulation that these large banks and their various subsidiaries, their various tentacles all over the world use both to make profits, but increasingly, and this is what I argue, increasingly to effect a political agenda. In other words, using oil prices as a means to destabilize the Russian government. And in many ways, to some degree, it's been working. For instance, you have seen economic decline in Russia directly affected by the collapse of oil prices. Inflation is on the rise. Unemployment is a growing concern. A lot of economic forces, and then you add on top of that the other weapon that's being used, and that's sanctions, directly targeting certain elements within Russia's ruling establishment, but that, of course, having ripple effects throughout the economy of the country. All of these things taken together, I think, demonstrate quite obviously an economic campaign of subversion against Russia in order to weaken its political and geopolitical position, which I believe the United States was rightly surprised by with Russia's assertiveness in Ukraine, with Russian assertiveness in Syria in particular. On the other hand, just quickly, you mentioned India. India is a very different case because, in fact, India is being wooed by the United States. I'm going to be writing about this in the coming weeks as well. India is actually the target of a charm offensive by the United States, and in particular the U.S. military, which is moving towards a full-blown military alliance with India. Now think about that long-standing rivalry that India has with China, the ongoing border dispute, the mutual distrust that the two Asian giants have of one another. You can see what the United States is doing. While it tries to isolate and contain China as much as that is possible, it is simultaneously trying to drive India back into the Western orbit and pull it away from the BRICS. A lot of geopolitical machinations, I think, that form the backdrop of what I've called the empire striking back against BRICS.
And, after listening to everything you said, is that enough for a build-up to World War III, considering China's isolation, Russia's isolation economically, and what's happening with the U.S. and India alliance? Do you think that this is enough for a build-up for World War III?
Well, I hate to be the World War III guy, because that was the subject the last time I was on this show, but I will say that the forces are certainly aligning to create that potential. I don't want to say that it is definitely going to happen or definitely isn't going to happen. I will say, though, that the forces do seem to be aligning, in particular when you consider all of these developments that I've mentioned against the backdrop, the elephant in the room, so to speak, the coming global economic collapse. Now, this is not me saying that. Eminent economists the world over are talking about a major global recession, if not depression, far larger than what happened in 2008. Now, if we consider that potential, the potential of that kind, that scale of an economic crisis, with all of the things I've mentioned, the growing conflict between Russia and the United States, the growing partnership between Russia and China, the drive by the West to pry them apart from one another, India, the nuclear power, Pakistan, a nuclear-armed ally of China, all of these different issues coming together against the backdrop of an economic crisis It certainly does create the possibility for global war. And again, I would reiterate a point that I've made numerous times. The beginning of each of the last 5 centuries has seen a global conflict relative to its time and place. From World War I at the beginning of the 20th century, the Napoleonic Wars, the War of Spanish Succession, the wars, the 30 Years' War, and those that came before it, that series of conflicts, each of which, in their time, engulfed what was considered at that point to be really the majority of the world. That potential is what we're staring down the barrel of, and it is frightening, to say the least.
And Eric, we just have 1 minute left, but considering everything that you just said, how are BRICS nations working within the system, though, as well as they resist Western meddling? Are they in turn using Western industries to also fight back? Does that make sense?
Well, in a sense, yes, because this is really what happens when you become intertwined with the capitalist system, a system that was designed, crafted, and executed by the United States and the British primarily, and the French as well. You play by the rules of that system, whether it's international debt settlement, whether it is investment methods or what have you. All of these things are really along the lines of capitalist development. That's why I started out by saying that BRICS is really competition to the West. It's not a true alternative. This is not some sort of socialist utopian alliance or anything like this. This is merely an alternative to the hegemony of global capitalism as it exists today. So yes, of course, Brazil and India and Russia and China, South Africa, they have investments. They're pushing their own investments. Brazil and various parts of Latin America, China, of course, all throughout Africa and elsewhere in Latin America as well. Russia, perhaps to a lesser degree. So these countries are certainly using that machinery of Western capitalism to enrich themselves. The question is, will they be able to create a true and legitimate alternative without fully breaking from this Western hegemonic system? I would argue, of course, no. And the fear of them breaking from that system, that's what's driving the attack on BRICS.
Well, we'll keep watching this as it develops. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining me today.
Thank you.